Welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Tark. I'm a former K-12 school teacher and currently associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. As chair of this session entitled Transformative and Peacebuilding Approaches to Interrupting Injustice, Reflecting on Teachers' Classroom Praxis, I've been asked to inform or remind attendees of a few points. Okay, so first, welcome to the International Symposium led by the UNESCO Chair in Democracy, Global Citizenship, and Transformative Education. The title of the symposium, Peace, Culture, and Social Justice. The symposium includes some 50 sessions with roughly 150 presenters from more than 35 countries in English, French, Spanish, and Korean. The session is being recorded. You might have seen a little message. It will be live on YouTube the following day. And therefore, there's some encouragement for attendees to watch in speaker view. Before we commence, I would like to invite everyone to attend other sessions as well as the keynotes and closing ceremony. Everything is open access, free, and registration can take place via the symposium website. For those unable to attend sessions via Zoom, everything is also available on one of our Facebook platforms in English, French, Spanish, and Korean. Okay, so my fellow presenters, Christina Parker-Shandell, Associate Professor in Social Development Studies at Renison University College, University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario, and Nicholas Ingefuk, Professor of Curriculum Studies at University of Ottawa, Ontario, and I have been called together here today, given our scholarly and pedagogical commitments and hopes that education can make a better world. That schooling, in particular, has an important role to play in advancing more just and sustainable human and planetary futures. In the spirit of this dialogical symposia that brings individuals together from distinct locations and contexts around the world, we met a few weeks ago to have a first-round conversation that we could try and replicate and extend in this conversation today. I was struck that even with our shared experiences and relatively familiar institutional context working in public universities in Southern Ontario, I think we ourselves struggled to find shared meanings across our different subfields, experiences, and backgrounds on how we talk about transformative school pedagogies for or as restorative justice and how they manifest or might manifest in classrooms. And so today we start a second conversation, and I think our approach is less about making persuasive or backed up arguments on how education might interrupt injustice, and more about illumination, surfacing and making examinable how we are thinking and trying to think about this important educational orientation and aim as informed by our research and lived experience. Still, at least for me, our aim of simulating a kind of live conversation translated in real time in Spanish to a much wider online audience of individuals coming in from potentially anywhere in the world is a bit daunting. Our approach here will be for each of us to provide an opening statement as a basis for subsequent unscripted conversation. I'm not sure how this conversation will pan out, even amongst the three of us, let alone with each of you from your own educational and political context from where you're zooming in. Of course, we will have time to move from our smaller conversation to a larger one during this 1 hour window. I suppose the uncertainty is inherent in this kind of global forum, oriented to cultivating intersocietal, intercultural, interdisciplinary, etc. dialogue. In my own work, I've been grappling with the limits and possibilities for schooling to be formative and transformative in the direction of human autonomy and justice. And because of the complexity and challenge of enacting critical education within the institution of schooling as embedded in the normalizing and reproductive forces of the state, the market, media, and other institutions. In much of my writing, I have probably written more on the limits rather than on the possibilities. Also in a context of hyperpoliticization, and at least in my context, a kind of mainstreaming or trending of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusive discourse, perhaps uplifted by progressive neoliberalism, which sort of co-joins the financial with equity, making profits with making a difference. I find myself increasingly focused on making discernments on how we scholars talk about how one talks about justice and critical pedagogy and where one talks for what purposes, etc. In today's conversation, beyond these initial comments, I will take a different approach in my contribution. The subtitle of our talk today, Reflecting on Teachers' Classroom Praxis, pulls me back to the actual classroom pedagogies and practices. And so for my small commentary, following Christina's and Nicholas's, I will do two things. First, I will lean into my teaching praxis across the K-12 to teacher education to graduate education continuum, and to give a more personal and perhaps grounded account. And second, I will be aiming to listen carefully to Christina and Nicholas's contributions with my teacher hat on, so to speak, to consider their provocations through a lens of teaching practice. I'm very interested to see how my co-presenters in turn have responded to the demand to begin a conversation. To get us going, I'm going to read our abstract because I've been asked to do that, and then pass it over to Christina. So again, the title, Transformative and Peacebuilding Approaches to Interrupting Injustice, Reflecting on Teachers' Classroom Praxis. Classroom teachers transmit values through their roles, and relations of power their students inhabit within daily classroom activities. Teachers' relations to historical truths and global crises shape how they invite and facilitate students' constructive study of multiple and challenging viewpoints. Done constructively, teachers' pedagogies can facilitate the engagement with otherwise marginalized voices and perspectives. However, where done poorly, such pedagogies can reinforce the social exclusion of those whose perspectives are unheard. Contentious issues such as settler colonialism and sociopolitical conflicts can become transformative pathways to educating students and building just and peaceful relationships. This kind of restorative justice approach to centering equity through dialogue challenges dominant neoliberal and conservative ideologies and can shift how educators approach and respond to conflict in ways that build peace and promote inclusion. In this session, we first present our perspective on transformative and peace-building pedagogies in relation to demand that education can interrupt injustice. And then we invite audience members to join the conversation. Okay, so over to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm grateful to be sharing this space with two wonderful colleagues whose work I followed for some time. To me, all three of us have been doing restorative justice and peace-building work that intersects in varying ways, which is what I think will make this conversation very interesting. And for us, it might look different in different contexts or called different things, but I also think that's the beauty of the practice, the ways in which we can adapt and connect with different folks depending on the situation and what the young people we're working with need. Many of you attending this conference are experts in education. Some of you might be newer to the concepts that we're talking about today. I think if there's one takeaway from our session, it's that the work that we're doing in the field of peace building, restorative justice, and transformative justice is just getting started. And I believe that each of you is part of the solution. So for my first bit of speaking today, I wanted to share three premises that I work with when positioning myself as a restorative justice practitioner who works in diversion programs, as someone who researches and studies restorative justice, and as a faculty member who teaches about peace building and social justice in schools. And these experiences inform how and what data I collect in my classroom-based research and how I see the world. So I wanted to first speak about the impact of identity-based harm as it applies to how I conceive and think about restorative justice in education. And in my research, I really empathize with the stories of the many young people who are harmed every day when they go to school. And that harm happens simply because of who they are, their identity, their racialized identity, gender or sexual identity, religion or class identity. The harm that I see often leads to further oppression of people who are already marginalized. And this experience for too many young people, particularly people of color, is a daily reality. And it's what some people would refer to as the school to prison pipeline, or really the cradle to school to prison pipeline. And it's enacted when schools essentially unfairly punish students of color or those from marginalized backgrounds. And that those punishments that are sometimes implicit, sometimes very explicit, but it seriously impacts those students' ability to learn and to stay engaged. And that's why it's referred to as the pipeline in this way. And these students may be more likely to skip school, more likely to lose interest in their studies, or even drop out because they feel targeted or powerless in the school system. They are also the students who often lack the resources and support to stand up for themselves. Down the road, this actually leads to lower future earnings and an increased risk of ending up in prison. So the use of harsh punishments in schools has many harmful consequences, both in terms of mental and physical health. So I just wanted to point that out as one sort of positioning of how restorative justice can be seen. Secondly, I wanted to speak about the importance of empowering students and how restorative justice, as I see it, is all about building genuine connections with students. My work on restorative justice as it's applied in education is based on a core belief, and it's a belief that a student that is facing challenges can significantly change their life's course by establishing just one meaningful relationship with an adult. And research supports this idea, that demonstrating that young people heading towards negative outcomes like incarceration or homelessness or health issues can actually redirect their path and be diverted because of that deep bond that they can form with a caring adult. I just finished an ethnographic classroom-based study of restorative justice practices. And over the 10 years that I've spent studying restorative schools, I feel like I've developed a keen eye in terms of quickly surveying a classroom community in school and understanding what that feels and looks like in practice. And I think about various students that sort of come to mind when I've been doing this research. And one student I wanted to share about today was a Black female student who was frequently sent to the principal's office. And when I interviewed her, she said to me, "When we go to the office, it's like we don't even get into trouble." And I paused at her saying that, and later on had connected with the principal. And I asked her, well, what did she think about students who described the office as a place where they don't get into trouble? And at first she had a look of surprise, and I feared I offended her, but then she sort of got it, and she saw this reflection as a compliment. And she said to me, "Well, yeah, of course, because that's what we want. We bring them down here and we want to know how they're doing. We want to help them feel better. And we do that, and we don't usually see them again, or at least not as often." So the student that I had interviewed, she continued to say, when she is sent down to the office, which is normally for many students seen as a place of further harm, she said in her experience, they just talk to us and ask us how we're doing. And she said, "I don't know why they ask the person you fought with to sit right beside you, but as much as you don't want to talk to them, you've got to, and it actually makes things better." So in a restorative school, adults are not people that young people fear. They're allies to interrupting injustice. And what remains constant is that all want to be involved in a respectful process where their voice matters. So the last premise that I'll speak about before passing it to Nicholas is the importance of what I refer to in my work as conflict dialogue. And the goal here is to have a strong relational connection where dialogue about difficult issues is still possible, and it's actually encouraged. So in my research, the teachers who had strong relationships with their students undoubtedly had deeper dialogue and engaged in conflict more readily. And those students were more likely to be academically and socially engaged in their classrooms. So this is not necessarily about talking about interpersonal conflicts between students, but conflicts that were actually embedded and taking up in the curriculum in a proactive way. So students can be given the opportunity to practice exploring conflicts, studying conflicts constructively, whether that be in literature, in history, in science, or even math. And they can practice the kind of restorative peacemaking skills safely within the classroom. I found that when students have those kinds of opportunities to engage in conflict proactively and safely, they are much more eager to learn and participate. And when those interpersonal conflicts do erupt, they might actually be better equipped to deal with them. So essentially, then the purpose of the restorative justice circle process, as it might look like in practice, is essentially to practice and think about how do you be in circle with those practices and those values being embedded into people's lives when they're not in circle outside of the classroom. So I think I'll pause there and pass it over to my colleague Nicholas, who, as Paul mentioned, is a full professor and Vice Dean of Graduate Programs at the University of Ottawa.
Thanks for that. I just want to confirm, Paul, we have 7 minutes. Yeah, I'm just going to start.
Yeah, I think we have a little bit of flexibility. Go, okay, yes, but well, please.
I just started at 7. So I just wanted to share like that in the Ottawa Carleton District School Board and Ottawa Catholic School Board, where I reside on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin people, and those two Anglophone school boards. In grade 11, students are now studying Indigenous literature as their English course as part of the curriculum. And so and the work that I'm going to share is a piece that grad student Patrick Phillip, a doctoral student, Brilliant, who we've been collaborating on to tackle in terms of what was addressed in one of the keynotes around artificial intelligence, thinking about settler colonialism, settler colonial futurities, and what we can learn from Indigenous futurities and in terms of Indigenous literature. And I won't get to that part now, but I wanted to draw the importance to our research team and the way in which we've been working with teacher education and thinking about history education is about how we can revisit historical narratives to challenge the ways in which they reproduce a settler colonial historical consciousness, and work to try to disrupt that by co-creating and co-constructing different interpretations and narratives of the past. And so we trace the development of this artificial intelligence from the beginnings of the nation state we call Canada, illuminating its physical and psychical inscription on the land and settler colonial thinking. We further move through how such thinking is seeped into how we understand ourselves as human biologically, and through practices of education, particularly through histories and lasting influences of eugenics. Returning to the material technology of AI and its futurities, we consider the implication of its future development and deployment amidst this enduring context of a discursive regime and its rule. And we conclude with a reading of an Indigenous futurist novel, The Marrow Thieves, as a counter-algorithmic, counter-genetic curriculum, hopefully inspiring future curricular thinking beyond the logics of settler colonial futurities. Just give me a second here to open the other one. Okay. So on the land we now call Canada, settler colonialism has operated algorithmically for centuries. Canada's national dream was born through algorithms of ethnocide, particularly this extinguishment and subjugation of this land's First Peoples. The logics of settler colonialism have been encoded and scarred into the very earth beneath our feet. Settler agri-eugenics have changed the climate and earth to displace traditional Indigenous foodways. The same logics have severed us from the very places we live in our everyday lives, cutting off our ability to perceive ways of relating outside a nuclear neoliberal capitalist worldview, in terms of what Paul had spoken to earlier. From the very start of a nation state formation here in what some of us call Canada, the school curriculum, its knowledge mobilizing systems, have and continue to engineer the artificial intelligence of settler colonial logics. In A Bounded Land, historian Cole Harris narrates how these logics took root in what we now call Canada. These same logics, we suggest, have informed a continuing settler algorithmic appropriation of the land and its material resources, into a neoliberal capitalist extractive state. As Harris recounts, before European settlers could operate in North America, quote, the European imagination had to make some sense of it, less perhaps to establish what was there than to arrange and order the land in terms that Europeans could understand, end quote. To be clear, such understanding would then establish, quote, the circumstances and conditions in which Indigenous communities could be controlled and exterminated physically and ideologically from the national consciousness, end quote. And that's St. Clair. This national intergenerational settler colonial consciousness endures and continues to foreclose the possibility of good relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples with Turtle Island and the more than human kin, our more than human kin. As Nigan James Sinclair reminds us in, quote, countries of the world, this is called ethnic cleansing, extermination, and genocide. In Canada, this is called progress, close quote. The earliest algorithmic gestures of settler progress, according to Harris, were the European settler compulsions to map and rename the lands of Turtle Island. Quote, once translated into this language, the land could be communicated and then could be argued and strategized over from afar, end quote. And this shifted land into a different category of information, what the Indigenous peoples did not need, but that Europeans did, for it allowed them to visualize space, and in turn, this rudimentary knowledge of the land made available in Europe became a considerable source of European power, a cartographic equation of power and knowledge that would be repeated across the continent. Abstracting and drastically simplifying appropriate Indigenous knowledges of the land have profound effects. Quote, a few lines on the map serve to eviscerate the land of its Indigenous knowledge, thus presenting it as empty, untrammeled space available for whatever the European imagination wished to do, end quote. Harris likens this settler imagination to a center of calculation after Latour, in which a few bits of information, real or fanciful, about a distant place could be put to work. In effect, the land became stripped of its local relational complexity and turned into a certain kind of computational data intelligible to settler, to what we're calling settler colonial algorithms. The algorithm of mapping synergized with European exploitation of the land and the introduction of disease to recalculate and reconstruct Turtle Island into allotments of land that were then transformed and colonized into settler private property. Here, James Dashik warns that those, quote, who place human agency and greed and the expansionism of colonial powers at the center of the decline of Indigenous nations in the Western Hemisphere are missing half the story, end quote. Such missing foregrounds the role of disease in biology and the displacement of Indigenous peoples from our historical consciousness as an emerging and evolving settler colonial democratic commonwealth nation state society. Harris notes that settler colonial logics made use of the terrible human toll that European introduced smallpox and measles took on First Nations, and how such devastation reinforced devastating and violent intergenerational material effects of settler colonial logics and its futurities. Early European cartographers, I'm out of time. See, look, there you go. So that's just a little sample for 1 minute. That's just a little sample of us rereading the way in which different historical accounts of the making of Canada can be troubled from by providing anti-colonial readings. And that as we move forward, we have another section on looking at eugenics and the movement of eugenics and education, and then end by doing a rereading of Demolin's novel, The Marrow Thieves, to look at how Indigenous writers now in Canada are writing these futurities, Indigenous futurities, as a critique and commentary on terms of these future imagined places, commenting on where we're at in the moment and how we continue to do harm to each other in terms of that perspective, to the planet, but also point to ways in which we can do things differently. So the key thing to take away in terms of this paper and conversation, as in terms of teacher education, is what can we learn from First Nation, Métis, and Inuit scholars, writers, communities, in terms of reimagining our relationships with each other as a restorative process, in terms of peace, in terms of democracy, but also in terms of the more than human world in our current relations. Okay, so I'll stop there and shut up.
Thanks so much, Nicholas and Christina. And I might just say a couple of things so I don't forget them later if I go to my own little couple of slides here. But just really appreciate both presentations and thinking about the school to prison pipeline and sort of what students learn through the process of school, marginalized students, and you know, so the demand for inclusivity, and not in a kind of surface kind of way. And then the Nicholas, I mean, talking about you know, revisiting historical narratives, which I consider a form of truth telling and truth searching and truth telling, because but you know, but I better just jump ahead. But I think both of those elements are distinctive forms of ways of interrupting injustice, and they have relationships, and which I'm quite interested in. So I'm going to try a screen share here. I don't have a beautiful narrative to present. I've got a couple slides here. Share screen. Oh, where's my screen here? Here we go. Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you have seen this TED Talk video by Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian novelist, which she calls The Danger of a Single Story. And I show it to my students in teacher education, and it's just such a beautiful entry to think about and talk about the in terms of education, either sort of advancing injustice or perhaps intervening injustice, sort of the way in which a single story, or perhaps the hegemony of a single story, excludes, miseducates, and rationalizes inequality. I mean, at least if we think about epistemic injustice, and the ways in which a single story can work as explicit curriculum when we sort of learn about what it means to be Canadian and the history of Canada, as Nicholas is referring to, or more implicitly in how the way that sort of what we might call single stories or kinds of mythologies that we learn, that we're enculturated into, such as heteronormativity, which doesn't necessarily mean the teacher's trying to teach this, but it's part of the null or hidden curriculum. And I just put that there, as I say, a kind of handle or axis for thinking. In thinking about the conversation that we had, and also my own practice as a teacher, I think this this difference between, you know, pedagogies as interrupting justice in the classroom space, which I think in some ways is a more substantive form of inclusive justice, inclusive education, versus pedagogies for interrupting justice, in terms of how we might develop and foster the capacities for future political engagement. So, and I think these differences are important, but depending on context, they can sort of be quite, you know, work quite well together, or in some ways be in tension. And it helps me think about this a little bit in terms of my readings and my own practice. But I should say that my own experience of teaching is mainly in fairly elite spaces. So I was an international school teacher in South America and Southeast Asia for a number of years, teaching in private international schools for relatively elite families that have this mission of, you know, global mindedness, international mindedness, you know, and they're using the vocabulary of social justice and inclusion and even decolonizing now. But there's certain, and even as the classroom spaces were fairly inclusive of these children. You know, one of the missing elements that in terms of the ways in which they could share stories and learn from each other was, of course, social class, which, you know, kind of becomes a kind of blind spot. So these questions of, you know, the ways sort of really promoting and fostering a kind of inclusive space for learning in the classroom that acknowledges the funds of knowledge and experiences of students, you know, doesn't perhaps always lead to a kind of transformative or decolonizing education. Again, it perhaps depends on the context. So one of the kind of handles or tensions or axes I'm thinking about, another one, you know, is the ongoing ways, well, this notion of schooling or education as you know, advancing injustice rather than intervening in it. So, or the issue of social reproduction versus the possibility of transformation. So, you know, and it's really, and sometimes, you know, restorative justice work is seen as something that all teachers need to be actively working in with, but at other times it seems like effectively it's about a small number of, you know, more informed or more critical minorities of teachers that are where the kind of pedagogy is a form of resistance or teaching against the grain. And so we've got this kind of tension between whether schooling is the problem or perhaps some kind of solution. So, you know, on the other hand, our growing witnesses, associations, and familiarities enables awareness and learning that allows us to be less ethnocentric, less nationalist, less racist, etc., and be able to disrupt the single stories in the classroom. So that's a kind of tension there. And in terms of, you know, when I think about my own teaching and with some recent work that I've done with two fantastic teachers who are certainly socially aware and challenge single stories, it's interesting to think about how the world enters the classroom spaces, both intentionally by the teacher in the form of a kind of enacted curriculum, or more unintentionally through the identities of teachers and students, and particularly students, and then how those are navigated and how we respond to them. And it reminds me of a little bit of the work of the teachers that maybe Christina was referring to, or the principal, in terms of working with what comes into the classroom as students bring their identities and questions and issues into these spaces. And then I mentioned this already, you know, at one level, we, you know, we might think about restorative justice as not passing on consciously or subconsciously these single stories, these mythologies of homogeneity, fixed pure identities, white supremacy, heteronormativity. And, you know, that can be oriented, or the purpose of that can, again, be about to include learners. I'm thinking about the way that Christina was speaking about it, not by not negating their lived experiences and identities, create a space in the classroom where they can actually participate. And then on the other hand, you know, these photos here of us are covering my slide, you know, to provide a more fulsome and multiple perspectives towards truth searching and truth telling as a kind of preparatory education for informed civic action. And again, these can work together well, or they can be in tension, as I say, but these are helpful ways that I think about the goals and approaches of justice-oriented critical education. And then as a final piece, and I guess in terms of thinking about my own, I guess less about what my intentions are as a teacher, but when I walk in this space of teaching and when I'm confronted with others in the classroom. And, you know, and I've written about this in different ways, about how there's a kind of relational ethical singularity that sort of comes into play that maybe softens some of the ways that we might want, say, critical pedagogy to be a kind of stronger force in the classroom. And I think that that's so Ron Sear's notion of intellectual equality or radical equality is that this is the assumption that needs to sort of breathe a presupposition for verification by schools. And the way that I think about it is kind of a almost sacred orientation to the student as capable in terms of understanding the conditions of their lives and these existential questions, and capable and incomparable and non-reducible to their performances on tests or you know, and I think you know, this is important for marginalized students, you know, of course, but you know, so it also exceeds kind of identity markers and is particularly important within elite educational spaces. Again, these are a few things that surface for my when I think about sort of the sort of how you enter into the classroom and the sort of vulnerabilities and everything, and sort of being in this space with learners that sometimes exceed what our intentions might be, and you know, just you know, the ways in which you know, speaking about a short experience of teaching in a urban school in southwestern Ontario, just the incredibly low expectations sometimes placed on the so-called alternative level or applied level students is you know, this deficit kind of a thing is extremely problematic. So I think I'm gonna stop there. I don't have a timer on, but I hope I didn't go on too long. Let me stop the share, and if I invite Nicholas or Christina to you know, we apparently we're supposed to leave 15 minutes, which we've got more than that. If we can maybe have a couple of comments, and then we'll open it up to the Nicholas or Christina. Do you just jump in if you want to say anything?
Well, I was just going to follow up in terms of what Christina and you both shared, like in terms of teachers and the roles in which they can play for either truth telling or the everydayness in terms of a restorative approach. And often in the past few years, what I've seen or witnessed in terms is that it's not only like the culminating fact of two students perhaps like fighting that such disciplinary punishment takes place or restorative, but it's in the everyday interaction. Say for a student, for example, who self-identifies and is racialized by others as being Black, showing up to class and saying, "Hey, why you're late?" when another student shows up late that are racialized being white and nothing's said, or creating certain rules for certain students in everyday. So those everyday interactions that don't culminate or bubble up to students being sent to the office often fall outside of the everydayness of the restorative approach. And I just wonder how, in terms of addressing that in teacher education or higher education or K-12. And I think more and more in terms of what I get discouraged, but also find hope is at the end of the day, teachers are adults and children are put in the care of adults, and the professionalism of teachers it kind of put, even though there's a standard of practice and ethic of care, they get reduced to these rules and these kind of professional relations, as opposed to remembering, like, we have children and youth in our care as adults, and how do we demonstrate that care? And that would go outside the context in terms of what's going on globally. Like, as a society, how are we caring for children and youth? So yeah, so I see, and then anyways, I just wanted to share that a little bit. Like that's what keeps me up at night these days, is trying to rethink the concept of care in relation to children and youth, and what are our responsibilities as adults.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Nicholas. Oftentimes you look to the teacher as being the person who should know how to handle conflict. And I think that, the kinds of identity-based conversations that can be opened up with what you were speaking about, Paul, in terms of exploring multiple identities, I feel that oftentimes when we're trying to prepare teachers to facilitate in teacher education, those controversial, I think sometimes identity-based dialogues, it could be challenging to really think about how do you scaffold and teach teachers to lean into those challenging conversations so that students are also comfortable taking it up in a safe way. And I think too often, despite having training and sometimes having revised curriculum design and maybe some really great opportunities to engage in difficult conversations, which is where I think that learning happens, the teachers sometimes do freeze or shut down. And I think that point is really critical to sit with, because I think as facilitators, we need to know how to guide those conversations. And when we open up spaces for youth, especially marginalized youth, we really have to make that painful choice of how do you engage in those conversations in the moment, and how do you embrace it in ways that could potentially facilitate more inclusion if you are really bringing in aspects that are sometimes peripheral or shut down in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, you want to bring in a multiplicity of stories, a balance of stories, as DJ talks about it. But another approach is to engage the single story, right? Engage the single stereotypes about different kinds of identities and what's expected of them. Because a lot of them, as Nicholas suggests, is kind of under the radar in a certain kind of way, right? And so there's that work to do with teachers and administrators. And I'm sure around disciplining, maybe that's been one of the kinds of more important or more common conversations about stereotyping different races in terms of behavior and disciplines. And it's probably, and it's, disappointing that it goes on, but it, like, just to give it like a kind of parallel example, and because my work is kind of in global and international education, we use sometimes, or some schools use the term international mindedness, which it's got its flavor, but it's again around about being open-minded and developing cultural humility and being open to the world, this kind of orientation, right? So when I say to teachers, who teach and who have this mission of teaching for international mindedness, and then I say, you can come and talk to my teacher candidates, or just begin some conversations. One kind of response is, I'm not sure I teach for international mindedness, or I'm not sure I understand exactly what that means, or I've got some ready-made things I can come and show your students or whatever. And all of that's fine, but the thing that I try to sometimes say, well then, okay, so but what kind of mindedness are you teaching for, right? And so again, so in, whether it's national mindedness or there's a way in which the null or the hidden curriculum is sort of in play that has to be engaged, right? And whether, like in some of those mythologies that I mentioned before, and that's also a kind of project, or another way of thinking about challenging and disrupting single stories that do damage to children and youth in schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Rita, for your comment about, teachers wanting to learn more, needing to learn more about culture and peace and engaging a little bit more. And, you know, I wonder if anyone has any thoughts or ideas about how we can do that. Like, what have you seen or what have you experienced? If anyone wants to share or reflect on that, or Rita.
That Clifford had mentioned, we call them young people, or, you know, fellow human beings. What could be another way of approaching that conversation. Yeah, go ahead, Clifford.
Hello, and thank you all. In the past, since internet, I've been unlearning my Canadian education and learning about our Indigenous culture, and I've gotten very, very involved in the past bunch of years because it all seems to make common sense. And just like yesterday on Instagram or something, I saw a meme that says if the Ojibwe word for tree is not an it or a thing, it's a relative. And as we treat all of creation as other selves, so in reference to what you were saying earlier, you're saying kids and children. Doesn't this give us a, do you get what I'm saying? And if we respect them, as young people, they're just young, but they're people. And I think most of society doesn't recognize kids and children as people. That's all I offer. And I'm so grateful to be witness to this conversation. And I chuckled when he said in the beginning that we open the conversation, we never know where it goes. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Does someone want to come in? Michael, yeah, please, Michael.
Thanks, and thanks to you all for raising these issues. I dropped a question for Nicholas in the side here just about a couple of the terms, which I really enjoyed. But I'm thinking of teacher education, and I guess I'm thinking, and I think all of you will have something to say about that. And I'm thinking that not everyone shows up to teacher education assuming I will be a change agent and I will actually learn enough about the history of the lands that we're on to actually begin to, sort of interrogate this in a meaningful way. But more too, that teacher education sometimes has a domesticating and stultifying effect. And I'm thinking about success on practicum and that whole business around I'm a nervous new teacher and I'm going to go out and I'm going to obey all the rules and I'll just read the curriculum as if it's, like some guidebook. And I mean, to that, I try to talk about short game and long game, and you have to survive. But there's a number of issues, and we I guess in teacher ed described this as Monday morning pressures. But we're putting things into a difficult starting point, by having processes in teacher ed that just do not necessarily. I mean, I guess folks like you and hopefully me are able to light a flame here and there, but the types of change that we need are bigger than just a few little sparks.
Yeah, I saw both your thanks, Michael, for your questions. Yeah, that in the essay, the Southern colonial algorithms is something that Patrick and I were working on from other work. And talking what we try to do is trace the concept of artificial intelligence not just being as AI or JA in terms of now, but we make the case that it's been around since the proactive attempts and conscious. So I wouldn't use the term unconscious because I can provide you several examples of conscious colonization of Canada. And Scribner magazine in 1905, 1906 Duncan Campbell Scott wrote an essay where he outlines like a settler futurity in that essay. So I can share a link to that, and it's very clear in 1905, like this is what's going to happen to Canada, and this is what the project. And it was a documentation of him signing Treaty 9, like so on. And coming back to what Christina shared in that essay about the use and symbolic use and fear and threat of the police, that what eventually became the RCMP, that they were feared more than even the contingent that went up to sign Treaty 9, like the kids and the. So he writes about that clearly in 1905. So you get like over 100 years in Canada. So this truth telling that Paul is talking about, and then what we show in terms of the mapping out and how artificial intelligence was then used to create policies and rules and correlations and data to then create this farming system, to create a tax-based system across Canada, and then the residential schooling system. So there was all of these different policies that supported the agro-eugenic movement across Canada. And even like Tommy Douglas, who's revered and people are referring to him in terms of the NDP, was a staunch eugenicist that's not spoken about in Canada. So rethinking these historical narratives, and I don't know, Canada in terms of being a certain age to become mature enough to be okay to be critical of a past without feeling that the whole sense of quote unquote what it means to become Canadian is going to fall apart. And maybe it will. So, and the last thing I would end on is, I think moving forward in terms of teacher education, because in teacher education in our program, we have a course that addresses First Nations, Inuit, Métis histories, perspectives, and contemporary issues, so that every teacher candidate is addressing that, but then also thinking about how that course in grade 11 is now being taken up. What can we learn from, like, in terms of Indigenous resurgence in Canada and First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, what can we learn from those colleagues, or unlearn moving forward to reimagine the kind of relationships that we might have, as Clifford said, with, as young people, human beings, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, beyond the kind of like what Paul pointed out is these identity, the reduction in use of, like, so I would argue that settler colonialism uses identity politics to segregate people into political factions, different, so that they're fighting against each other. So how do you combat that as a system? I don't know what the answer is to that. You're right. It's a lot bigger than just teacher education. So how can we do our own work in some sort of way to address that?
Does anyone else have any thoughts or responses in the room? Reflections?
Since nobody's speaking, if I may, what about teaching our young people how to approach the older people who don't get this? Adult education. Adults have more difficulty learning. Even me, I spend hours trying to go over this. So many adults don't even, for whatever reason, don't want to know how to improve the world. They've given up, and the young people are the future. If we can teach them to teach their parents as maybe a side course. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. I think that at least in the restorative justice world, there's a lot of people who share that the kids do a better job at it than the adults do, and sometimes the teachers themselves or this on staff are in conflict, and sometimes they're not able to facilitate in the same way that sometimes young people can themselves. And I think the goal is to actually equip young people with those tools and skills so that they can facilitate those conflicts amongst themselves and share.
Yeah, Clifford,
go ahead.
if I could just add to what Christina said, like, look, Cindy Blackstock, that I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with on projects, is with the Caring Society. They have the Spirit Bear School and campaigns where they are working with youth to address social justice, and so teachers and youth are doing that civic engagement and social justice action. So they're both learning about the truth telling, but then also have acts of empowerment to actually write to politicians to do that kind of work.
Social action, yeah.
Yeah, social action. So it is taking place. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Clifford, I think it's both ways that is really a problem, and the intergenerational dimensions of education is almost lost, right? Like learning is so ubiquitous and it's oriented to the market, and everyone can do it. You can do it anywhere and everywhere, at least for more elite groups, and it's there's a deficit in understanding of what education is for, or the difference between learning and education, and how learning needs to have some kind of orientation, right? And sometimes I put a thing in the side there, but I think sometimes we ask too much. There's so many demands on education, and it sort of links back to Michael's question. And so in our world of trouble and under these global crises, there's so many demands on education and the power of education to make change. But that question of how education can make change educationally, I think is sometimes lost, and we so that's one element. And it's such a teacher education is such an impossible practice, in the sense of I guess creating a kind of orientation such that that teacher candidates or beginning teachers have a sense of the importance of study, of studying their practice, and also learning sort of thinking about sort of intercultural learning in the context of their program, but also as emerging learners as they move out into schools. It's an ongoing process.
Yeah. Thank you for this opportunity. I wasn't saying that this isn't going on, because I believe since the internet, we are subtly learning that all over the world, there are hundreds and thousands and millions of small communities and neighborhoods who are being their best in their neighborhoods, doing what they can. And they don't have Facebook pages and everything to show it. I do believe there's way, way more good going on in the world than we know about. And I'm very, very hopeful and positive. And being part of this symposium, I'm realizing that me as just a guy in the community, I'm not even any academia, but I've been active in youth from Cub Scouts. I stuck with them for 20 years as a scouter. So I know it's everywhere. And these symposiums where we're getting minds from all over the world together to just promote this and expand it and get past that 25%, everybody else will jump on the bandwagon. Anyway, thank you very much.
Someone want to jump in, and we're almost out of time if you want to get a quick comment in.
I'll jump back in. The way that nationhood is somehow tied up in the project of teacher education is highly problematic. So everything that we're talking about the settler colonial state, etc., somehow teacher ed becomes this training ground, and it we're talking about unlearning, right? And actually you're talking about learning in order to address and to resist, right? But the project of nationhood is so embedded, and it's funny how some folks can slide through this teacher ed thing without being challenged, and then they go out and they're just teacher technocrats, and that's what I'm seeing. It's not pretty.
There is a psychic cost. I'm just thinking about something going on in Gaza right now, but there is these technical responses and the trends and the kind that we criticize or critique, but there's a psychic that, you know, I do think that there's phenomenologically people are, you know, have a capacity and engage, have this kind of, you know, pick your word, kind of responsiveness to others. And I think there's a psychic cost for the nationalisms and the wars and conflicts and the violence in the world, and people who aren't necessarily affiliated in terms of identity or family are increasingly feel that cost in an interconnected world. And so, you know, I think that's another piece in play in terms of you know, inviting teachers to think about their responsibility as educators and adults to introduce and bring the new into an old world that's, you know, in many ways in trouble. And you know, Clifford's has some important insights, and but in some ways adults are you know, giving up on their responsibilities in you know, in multiple kinds of ways, which you know, depending on how you think about education, you know, some would argue that I mean, if you look at someone like Greta Thunberg, it's interesting. I'm not sure what she's saying now, but the way that she addressed the UN and the different bodies was not giving them ideas to solve climate change, but shaming, you know, adults for why, you know, she says, you know, I shouldn't be here. I should be back in school. And I think actually some of these messages from her have a lot to teach, you know, those who want to take responsibility for our world as adults and educators. I don't know the rules here. I see the time is 4:02. Are we able to keep talking for a while?
Where's our main host?
Let's see what it says.
If you want
Okay.
a couple more minutes, you're more than welcome.
Okay. So please just leave if you'd like to. There's no expectations, but if you'd like to
I was just going to follow up, Paul. I just in response to Michael, is that at least from what I've seen in a short time, like in a minuscule time span in terms of 18 years, and then what I experienced in school before that, is that there are different stories available now that perhaps weren't part of the school curriculum before. So at least that's hopeful, and it doesn't mean that everyone will have access to those or wants to have access, but there are more, and that's not to say that there's not a lot more work that needs to be done, but there were, you know, at least there's a little glimpse or a little, you know, there's a little crack. Yeah.
I mean, some of my students, and again, this is, you get different kind of students, you know, some that don't want to maybe engage with this, but others that are like leading the charge, right? And then you worry about what happens when they step into the school or whatever. But it you know, there's definitely some of the students that are really receptive to this. I'll say that in terms of some of the group that I teach.
Wonderful. I wonder if there's anyone who hasn't had a chance to connect or share that has any thoughts that they wanted to.
Yeah, I saw a screen open. I thought they wanted to say, but maybe they were just cheering people on. Not sure.
Anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak yet?
Well, perhaps then we can use this pause as an indication that we need to move on to the next thing in our likely busy schedules. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today to this session. It's been a real opportunity to think about the topic and how to speak to it in a way that hopefully is brings in you know, fosters a kind of rich conversation, ongoing conversation, and you know, from Paul Carr, please feel invited to attend other sessions that are ongoing, I think, until Friday afternoon. I'd like to thank the support people. Is it Amanda? Amanda, thank you,
Yeah.
and the translators and my co-presenters, and have a great day.
Yes. Thank you to all the wonderful presenters and to everyone who engaged in conversation today. It was incredibly inspiring and left me with a lot to think about. So thank you to all of you.